Welcome to this webinar called Investment, Innovation and Infrastructure, Making SAF a Scalable Reality. I am Kata Cherub. I lead the aviation team at PA Consulting, and I will be mostly asking the questions on today's panel discussion. But first, I have been asked to give you some logistical notes, which I will read. The rest of it I won't read. I want to make sure I get all of this correct. So I think you would have seen that the session is being recorded. It will be distributed to attendees within the next few days. There will be a Q&A function, so please do ask your questions, and they will be monitored and filtered through to us on the panel. If you do have any technical problems, please mention them in the chat, and the Sustainable Aviation Futures team will try and help you. And I think the last thing is we will be doing a few polls when they are launched. It'll be sort of towards the back end of the webinar. When they're launched, they will pop up on your screen. They're hard to ignore. Please do engage with them, and then we'll discuss some of the things that we are seeing in the results. I think with that, that's the logistics. So welcome again. I will now ask our panelists to briefly introduce themselves. I will just say one more time. So I lead the aviation team. I've spent the last 20 years working in commercial aviation, airlines, airports, investors and policymakers. I work very closely with my colleague Grant, who's on the other side of this panel. You'll see us tag a team on this discussion. And briefly, let me hand to Andy from Gevo, just to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Katja. I am, as it says on the slide, the Chief Customer Marketing and Brand Officer for Gevo. I'm focused on building the ecosystem that supports successful commercialization of SAF, and I've spent 40 years building businesses primarily in renewable plastics, chemicals, and materials.
Great. Thanks, Andy. And Margot?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Margot Toyer-Rosa, and I'm Staff Procurement Manager for Air France. So we are buying still a lot of fuel, a lot of kerosene to make our aircraft fly, but we are now really involved in all the SAF pathway, and I'm really dedicated to all the SAF purchase for Air France, and we're doing this together as a group with KLM as well.
Great. Thanks, Margot. We'll get into some of the details of what it means to procure SAF in this day. And Grant.
Yeah, thank you, Kata, and thank you to Andy and Margot for being here as well. I work here at PA, based out of our Denver office. One of my core areas of focus here is clean fuels. I do quite a bit of work that focuses on hydrogen, ammonia, RNG, and of course SAF. We help clients in both the US and the UK, EU navigate, regulatory policy considerations, think about market entry, asset development, acquisition, risk mitigation, and go to market. Beyond SAF, I also do quite a bit of work in gas and power market fundamentals, energy infrastructure as well.
Great, thanks, Grant. So hopefully you see we've got a good mix, different geographies, different places in the value chain. So hopefully we shall have a rich discussion. So the first thing I just wanted to set the scene with is about scaling SAF. So this is the topic. This is really about taking that huge leap forward. If you could move us to the next slide, just to illustrate with sort of how we think about this in terms of the scale up. The bridge metaphor is intentional. It's about going across from where we are today to the future, and the shape of it is also intentional insofar as any one of these building blocks not being in place can help to destabilize scale up. This isn't SAF specific. I want to be clear. At PA, we do a lot of work on clean technology scale up. We work across different industries, and generally speaking, these building blocks hold true across all of these scale ups. So you'll see we've got one block which we're calling resources, capital. We'll talk about that in some detail. Technology, infrastructure, and skills. So these are the ingredients. Then there needs to be a framework through which the scale up is happening. So here we've put this into policy and regulation, legal compliance and assurance. There'll be many touch points to the SAF scale up challenge that I think we'll touch on as well. And then lastly, but certainly not least, this acceleration idea of market development support, awareness and collaboration. Again, very important to clean tech scale up across different sectors. So this is maybe a reference that we will use as we go through this discussion. The other thing, which we won't go into a huge amount of detail, because I think if you're on this webinar in 2025, you probably already know that SAF is the primary lever to decarbonize aviation in the next couple of decades. There will be others, and they're also important, but we know this is the most significant one. And the scale of the challenge is the thing that makes this particularly exciting or particularly daunting, depending on your perspective. So the scale up that we're talking about, from around 1 million tons of SAF produced and used last year to about 300 to 400 million, is phenomenally steep. And the reason we are particularly focused on the next 5 years is if we do the maths, we can see that any delays between now and 2030 will make this ever less likely that we will achieve the scale up that is needed for aviation decarbonization. So we will talk a little bit about some of the research we've been doing all across the ecosystem as we go through this. But if you move to the next slide, I guess I would just sort of describe this as we've been reflecting on this as a team and working in this space around the world. We are thinking of this scale up in terms of moving from a cacophony to a symphony. You can probably see where that's coming from. There's a huge amount of noise. There has been a lot of talk about SAF in different parts of the world. It's not particularly joined up, unlike, for example, the traditional jet fuel value chain, which has been working very smoothly. It's extremely well established, and we are a very, very long way from that. So to set the scene, that's essentially what we're going to be getting into, making this scale up a reality. How do we move from the noise to a more coordinated, more organized, more symphonic scale up in SAF? So I think that's sort of the introduction. Now let's get into some of the details. So what are we actually talking about in terms of the SAF value chain? Ros, move us along one more, please. And I think this will be the last slide. We have to go a couple of levels down. It's not just about demand and supply, and we want to get into some of the details so that we can unpick some of the bottlenecks and also identify some of the opportunities that are going to help us to scale. This is an illustrative, stylized value chain, simplified, but you can see that we have feedstocks on the far left as an input. We have SAF production. Fuel logistics is an important piece in the middle, which is joining up the supply and the demand which we have characterized as offtakes, procurement, consumption. So if you refer back to the introduction, Margot is very much at the far right of this value chain. Andy is towards the left. Grant and I work somewhere in the middle, and we will be touching on each of these. So I guess just to kick us off for getting into the discussion, reflecting on this value chain, perhaps from the demand side, Margot, if I could just ask you to outline your Air France KLM vision, your level of ambition, and how you're thinking about engaging with this SAF value chain.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Kata. I think for an airline, so as an airline, what is really important is to provide visibility on the demand. And what we've done, is my camera working?
I can see some beautiful background,
yeah,
but your face just disappeared.
I'm not here anymore. Okay, never mind.
We can hear you fine.
So Air France and KLM, acting as a group, has a strong ambition in terms of decarbonization, and we aim to reduce our CO2 footprint, CO2 emission by 30% per passenger kilometer by 2030. So compared to 2019. That means, and what has been validated by SBTi, that means 10% of SAF on our total fuel consumption by 2030. 10% of SAF is 1 million tons of SAF, including the Refuel EU mandate. So what we need to realize is, acting as a group, Air France, we have our main hub in France, and KLM has her main hub in Amsterdam. And so we will have by 2030 Refuel EU mandate, so with the obligation for the fuel supplier to actually incorporate 6% of SAF for all the flights departing EU. That means, so it's only departing EU, and we have a 10% ambition for SAF. So that means we really have a voluntary scheme on top of the mandate, the regulation framework, to actually achieve our ambition. So what is really important is, first, to have a regulatory framework to actually provide to the producer, the SAF producer, the transparency, the visibility that we will have like a mandate for SAF to actually produce SAF, and on top of that, we have voluntary scheme to go beyond the mandate.
Great, thanks, Margot. And we will definitely get into some of those differences between voluntary and mandated demand and what that means from a producer perspective. Andy, over to you. How do you see this value chain as Gevo? How are you engaging with it? And I guess maybe as sort of a segue, looking at where do you see the biggest challenges, the biggest blocks at the moment?
So Gevo, we believe that most of the SAF today in the world is HEFA, and e-fuel is getting a lot of attention as something that's very attractive. But there's a big gap between the amount of HEFA that's going to be available between now and 2050, when e-fuel starts to come into the market in quantities that are value reasonable, not a premium, I guess, not an excessive premium. And so at Gevo, we're focused on decarbonizing hard to decarbonize industries. This clearly is one of those. And we've been focused on alcohol to jet as the technology to do that. We produce the most alcohol to jet in the world. We're not currently producing it today because we've done all that at small scale to validate the pathway, the technology, and all of the approaches that we're using. And we've had our SAF flown on airlines around the world. We're best known at Gevo for our ATJ 60 project in Lake Preston, South Dakota, which last year received a $1.6 billion guarantee from the Loan Program Office at the U.S. Department of Energy. But we're working on projects around the world and additional projects in the U.S. Earlier this year, we acquired Red Trail Energy, and we've now renamed that Gevo North Dakota, where there's a 60 million gallon low carbon ethanol facility and a Class 6 carbon sequestration well. And we intend to take those two assets and build a alcohol to jet conversion asset there with those, so that we have an integrated 30 million gallon SAF facility in the US along with our ATJ 60 project.
When do you expect that to be commercially producing, Andy?
We're working to target commercial production in the 2029, 2030 timeframe. And then we also have designed that so that we do all of our designing in a modular design, so that we can, as I say, edit, copy, and paste around the world. And we have projects underway in Europe and Asia, and we're exploring possibilities in other geographies as well, South America, India, for additional projects where we can drop that engineering design for 30 million gallons into those facilities. One of the other things I want to make sure I mention is that we believe decarbonization claims have to be substantiated. And because of that, and in order to do that, because no one was doing end-to-end carbon tracking and tracing, we built our own Verity Carbon tracking and tracing business, where we use digital ledger technology to work with our feedstock producers and track all the way across the supply chain to delivery to the airport for our airline off-takers. So that part of the business is out there too, because we believe that if we're doing this all for decarbonization, you better track the carbon.
Got it. Margot, before I jump to Grant, I'm interested in what you make of that, the verification and the tracking all the way through. Is that something as Air France, and when you're looking at procuring SAF, is that something you care about, and how does that materialize?
So if we're talking about flexibility mechanism, for the moment, we really do rely on a mass balance approach. That means on an airline point of view, we can actually buy, purchase, and get some SAF into consumption at any airports we fly, and we respect the limit of 50% of our uplift on each airport. Just it's to be compliant with the blending ratio, the existing blending ratio regarding HEFA right now. So we can buy actually SAF anywhere in the world because we're flying anywhere, but we do rely on really strict sustainability criteria. That means that if we have different kind of SAF produced in Asia, in the US, it has to be compliant with the EU regulation, and especially, the RED 3 and all the feedstocks listed in the part A and B of the RED 3. That means not all the feedstock, I would say, available in all the regions in the world could be compliant with the Air France and KLM criteria.
And that's a beautiful segue. No planning. It tees us up to get into some of the policy discussions, and I wanted to start with you on that, Grant. Margot just brought to life very specifically what these different requirements around feedstocks, around different SAF characteristics, how they influence the opportunity to make offtake agreements, to uplift, to actually use SAF. You're obviously very US focused, so I won't be quizzing you on EU, although I know you probably could. But what do you see as how do you see this in your work with developers, with investors in particular, the influence of policy? And I guess I have to ask, in the US with the recent volatility, let's say, in the policy landscape.
Sure, that's a great question. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head right now. A bit of volatility in the U.S. policy landscape. I think the biggest question right now on the U.S. front, at the federal level at least, is what's happening with the IRA and 45Z, which is the tax credit that would be available to SAF producers. There's a bit of uncertainty right now with the future of the IRA and how 45Z guidance will shake out. The Biden administration, they did finalize 45V, which was for hydrogen, and they essentially punted on 45Z and left it up to the Trump administration. We don't see 45Z going away. We're still pretty optimistic on its prospects. We do think it has a future. From a political standpoint, doing away with it could prove to be a bit untenable. There's a big agricultural nexus with SAF and biofuels production in general in the US. A lot of feedstock and even project siting is happening in red states or states that lean Republican. And you also have a lot of oil majors that are getting into this space, whether it's in production or along the supply chain. They've got a vested interest in SAF as well. And beyond just SAF, 45Z is the replacement for the blender's tax credit in the US. And that tax credit is or was claimed by producers of biodiesel. And US biodiesel, renewable diesel production is over 3 billion gallons a year last year and growing. And so, a lot of parties already have skin in the game, and a lot of those are oil majors. So we think there's a lot of momentum behind maintaining and ironing out 45Z, whether that takes the form of guidance issued this year for this tax year and claimed in 2026, or there's a bridge that's the extension of the blender's tax credit. We're not sure there yet, but we do see that there's a future there. And I think it's also important to emphasize that beyond the federal level, you're seeing states take leadership here. There's a lot of local and state-specific incentives that have either already passed or that are being advanced right now, and states are trying to incentivize this as well. And they're doing that in a couple different ways. You see some states that are looking at trying to incentivize feedstock production or SAF production in their borders. And you also see states that are trying to incentivize sort of development of infrastructure and offtake in SAF. Minnesota is a great example of that. And this is, either a tax abatement or a tax credit. Sometimes it's incentivizing both production and offtake. So I think leadership at the state level is important here. So while there is some uncertainty, volatility at the federal level, we do see there being a path forward, and we do see these incentives staying in place. And obviously these are critical for producers, feedstock suppliers, and off-takers.
Absolutely. Andy, do you share that view, that assessment of grants? How do you manage this across the different sites that you're investigating and planning for?
I do see that very similarly to what Grant sees. We believe that at the federal level and even at the state level, the investment that SAF represents in the U.S., the energy security that it represents, the jobs that will be created building these plants and operating them, and the demand for agricultural products, all are things that are aligned with what the current federal administration would like. And we are seeing the states step in with various programs of their own because of all those same factors. And if they lean to a different set of priorities, it has that factor as well. So that's very true. If I expand a little bit globally, we see different drivers around the globe and in different positions, and that's part of why we've got all of our project activity that I mentioned at the forefront on a global basis.
Got it. Yeah, absolutely, Andy. And we certainly see that as a key thing that both investors and developers and also off-takers, and I'll come to you next, Margot, in terms of how you view it, must be on top of this emerging policy landscape. We wrote a paper on this last year called it's sort of Europe versus US as sort of an experiment in policy effectiveness. And I think we are seeing this as an actual live experiment in terms of what's working, how this scale up is playing out. In Europe, where you and I are, Margot, Refuel EU UK mandate took effect 1st of January this year. We see it from an interest in producers and investors that this has been positively received as policy certainty. But we're also picking up quite a lot on some frustrations, some teething problems, some pushback from different parties involved in uplifting mandated SAF. What's your experience at Air France to date on refuel?
So today, Air France and KLM, we fully support, all the EU ambition to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. So we really support the mandate. I think it provides, really transparency on the demand, on what we have to achieve. So today we really, stay in our position to say mandates and a clear regulatory framework is really the key to actually embark everyone in this decarbonation journey.
And in terms of specific experiences, you of course you uplift, you buy SAF in the US, you also do in Europe. How does the experience as an airline, the process differ due to the policy differences between the two regions? Of course, there's others as well, but for main focus for between Europe and US.
So we talked previously about what is mandated SAF and what is voluntary SAF. So under the EU, the mandate is really for the fuel suppliers. So they actually have the obligation to incorporate the volume of SAF. Air France has become a fuel supplier for its activities at CDG Airport. So we need to source our own mandate departing CDG. So for sure, we will go and buy, what is available in the market and what makes sense to actually reduce the cost of SAF. It's always like, we already, if I can provide you some figures. So for example, kerosene, because we still buy a lot of kerosene to make our flights, our aircraft fly, and to reduce, the extra cost of SAF, because kerosene is already 30% of our, global cost structure, and we don't just to keep, an operating economically, a great operating margin, we need to buy SAF and to optimize the cost for SAF. So the mandate today, the way we decided, for example, to source and to finance SAF is to actually put a surcharge on our flying tickets. So actually the customer who is flying on Air France is actually paying a surcharge for this mandate, because we have already been incorporating 1% of SAF in 2024. So we need to pay for it. So for this, so the surcharge is here to finance the mandate, and the voluntary scheme today is financed by our corporates through our SAF corporate program. And on a voluntary basis, the sourcing we can do is actually much more flexible, because we can buy and purchase SAF. So going back on your question, we can buy SAF everywhere worldwide where it makes sense to economically to buy SAF. So we can actually take the most of the SAF allowances available under the EU ETS scope, which is really really particular. Also, we can get SAF, for example, in California. So we used to do it, and we will continue as long as the IRA is still in place, and we can get, some incentives in Californian airports. And anywhere we can get, for example, in the London Heathrow or airports, incentives when you can lower the gap of the price for SAF. I think it's really interesting to diversify your different source of SAF.
Got it. It's a pretty complex picture. Are you able to say how many SAF contracts you might be, or how many SAF agreements you might have in a particular year? I mean, you as Air France KLM, you're one of the biggest, if not the biggest, SAF users to date. So I'm guessing there's lots, dozens. I would hazard. Bring that to life for us a little bit, Margot, in terms of what it takes to stay on top of that as this starts to ramp.
So there are not, dozens offtake agreement with the SAF producers today. So we are securing, volume of SAF first to fulfill our own mandate, and then to fulfill our voluntary scheme. So we have today different kind of SAF producer. We have the biggest oil majors. So we can see for the moment Total Energy, who will be really producing beginning of 2026 in France. And we have signed a master offtake agreement with Total Energy with a potential of 1.5 million tons for a period of 10 years. We have signed also another offtake agreement with DG Fuel, which is a US bioadvanced fuel, but they will start, producing in 2028. So it's really, so different kind of SAF producer or majors. What we can call, the newcomers, such as Gevo, such as, DG Fuel, with who we have already contracted an agreement with, and then also the big players, and we know also the big players already acting and producing today.
Got it. Thanks, Margot. Andy, back to you a bit from the Gevo perspective. The picture that Margot has painted, airlines signing offtake agreements over a period across a portfolio of different providers. How do you see that from your side? I'm obviously aware that you also have a number of agreements with off-takers. Talk us through that sort of portfolio building a bit from the producer perspective.
Yeah, and I'll tie a couple other concepts in here as we go. I think the first piece is that we view the products that we're making as two co-products. We're making a liquid fuel, and we're making tons of carbon abatement happen. And so in order to do that, we have the two products. You're going to need financing for all of these plants worldwide. And as Margot touched on, some of that is mandated, some of that is voluntary, some of that will come from consumers, some of that will come from corporates, some of that will come from incentives from governments. But what we're really trying to do is offset the capital required for that new set of co-products. And we know that the demand for fuel is out there. We know what the value of the fuel is for airlines, and no one really wants to see the fuel costs go up. So at Gevo, we focus to make sure that we can deliver fuel on a cash cost basis that's competitive with the cash cost of Jet A. But in order to do that, we've got to build new plants, which in this inflated environment are now competing with plants that were built 30 plus years ago and have been paid for. And so we're building the new house with the new mortgage next to the guy who's got just a little bit of maintenance capital to pay for his plant. And so it's how do you finance that capital? And that's what gets into the incentives, the mandatory market, or the voluntary market. And I think it's that financing of capital and how we unlock that becomes really critical in how we do this. And then to bring it all back together, it's that demand for the co-product, the carbon abatement that we're creating, that we really need to see that market develop and value that co-product and the cost of doing that in an integrated jet fuel facility, regardless of the pathway to make that jet fuel facility, that will unlock the capital needed to build this industry.
Absolutely. And I think that it's sort of yet another parallel scale up, evolution, maturity on carbon accounting. is just another thing that is adding to what we're currently describing as a cacophony. And working in this space, you have to be an expert in fuels, in feedstocks, in carbon accounting, in the commerce, and the capex. There's a lot in there. Thanks, Andy. And now in between, so we've just had sort of the demand side, we've had the producer side. One of the bits that often is less well understood is this logistics in between. So getting the product, Andy's making some SAF in somewhere, and airlines want to uplift it somewhere. Obviously, with SAF in particular, there's an incentive and imperative to be as close to the offtake as possible, to minimize costs and additional carbon footprint, but also there are often choices in between in terms of how that market is accessed. I know, Grant, this is an area you and other colleagues have worked on a fair bit in the last year or two. What are the key things that you are seeing projects either struggle with or get around in this place, and actually joining up the supply and demand?
Sure. Thank you. I think it's, it's really project and location dependent, but at a high level, you've kind of got, three choices. You can sell your SAF ex-refinery. You can work with a fuel services company for delivery along the supply chain, or you can try to take on parts of the supply chain yourself. And the first two are perhaps a little bit easier. You're probably giving up some margin and some opportunity along the way. We've also seen producers that want to control their product along the supply chain. They want to know where it's going, what it's being blended with, and they want to be sure of carbon accounting on their end and quality control. And so that's when you get to this third option, this sort of taking on the supply chain yourself. And it's tough to break into this space. Right now, this supply chain is controlled by incumbents. A lot of these are global oil majors or major midstream companies in the US, same in the UK, the EU. And right now, jet fuel is a comparatively simpler commodity. It's a pass-through. You make it, you put it in a pipe, you ship it, you can store it at a fuel terminal. You're not blending it like road transportation fuel. So the margin that you can make on jet along the supply chain is comparatively less than the margin that SAF presents, because SAF requires some new dedicated infrastructure, some segregated storage. It requires blending. It requires, multiple certification steps along the way. And so it's a potentially high margin fuel, or if you're looking at it from the other way, a supplier or producer, potentially a high cost fuel for some of this. So it's, how do you navigate that? How do you weigh those pros and cons with your project? And a lot of that depends upon, where you are, what your feedstock is, your location, and your offtake. Where are you sending it? And so all of those sort of come together to influence how you think about the supply chain and how you think about trying to overcome these barriers. And I think regardless of how you think about that and how you're trying to overcome it, what's also become clear is that we do need some dedicated SAF infrastructure to emerge. If you're going to ship it by pipeline, we've got to have new segregated SAF storage along the route for the neat SAF, for the transmix. We need dedicated blending terminals. We need more space for those blending terminals. And if you're going to be doing it by rail, you need more train capacity. You need to be able to leverage unit trains. So there's a lot of considerations and a lot of things that can end up being project and client specific along the supply chain that can sort of influence how you think about SAF production, supply chain delivery, and approach there.
Great, thanks, Grant. Andy, how do you think about this at Gevo? How far into the detail of deciding where to hand over the product, where to blend, where to offtake? What's your approach to this?
I have a couple of thoughts here. One is our approach to it has been to make it as easy for the offtaker as we can, and to manage Gevo's investment in what we're doing. And so for that, what we're doing is collaborating and partnering with folks close to the airports that can do the blending for us and get the product delivered to the airlines. But I think there's another aspect of this as we talk about scale up that just intrigues me as a business builder. We're doing this because we want carbon abatement. That's what we want to have happen around the world. And yet we want to put SAF on various logistics mechanisms and ship it around the world, which adds to the carbon footprint. We need to make sure that we're enabling a book and claim system that allows the right mechanisms for tracking, tracing, and avoiding double counting. but allows us to simplify the supply chain so that we can deliver it with the smallest footprint, because at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to achieve.
I had a feeling we might touch on book and claim, and you went right there. Margot, do you want to add anything on that point? Obviously, this is a live discussion with different initiatives, different perspectives in different parts of the world. What's your assessment?
So our assessment is, as long as the refuel EU is not really not clear, but we will respect what is written into the refuel review directive, and that means regarding the flexibility mechanism, we will adjust and adapt our sourcing according to what can be done. And today we can see that there are a lot of tool popping up to actually, and we can say that RSV is pretty much also advanced in all this book and claim, and but there are also other tool, and we need to make sure that the book and claim will work and still under a regulatory framework.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
for the moment, I think we're not ready to talk about book and claims. So, and I fully agree. If we really want to talk about CO2 abatement, etc., we should actually be able to have all this flexibility. But for the moment, we really rely on the mass balance approach. So it's still a physical delivery of SAF at some airports. Yes, but under the EU geography, we are quite lucky to have all the ARA region, and especially Amsterdam, Rotterdam. We have a lot of cargos coming in, and also in France we have Le Havre, so the port of Le Havre, which is quite ready for all these blending activities, and already like having a lot of volume of SAF coming in for France.
Got it. There's two questions that have popped up in the Q&A, which I think are best put to you. One is explicitly aimed at you. So could you provide some more detail on the feedstock suitable for Air France KLM criteria? And there's a specific example. Is woody crops to be produced on degraded land suitable? Now we're getting into the specifics of red. Are you?
So we do rely on all the feedstock listed in the Renewable Energy Directive. So we agree with all of type of agricultural waste and residues, but also forestry residues. So when we talk about woody crops, we need to make sure that this woody crops is part of what is allowed and listed in this appendix. And whenever it is allowed, so we do rely on this, but we exclude pommy, for example. We exclude what is made of palm oil and pommy. But whenever we talk about forestry residues, we know that it's really a tricky feedstock. So we will be really careful about talking with a project using forestry residues.
And then the other quick question is about the carbon attributes being sold separately when the fuel is already used. So this is your scope 1, our scope 3. Certainly at PA we've got some experience, and we certainly know it's a grey area. That the question is, can it be sold? Is that something you're involved in at Air France? So essentially separating the environmental attributes from the physical SAF.
Yeah, exactly. So when I'm talking about the voluntary scheme being financed by our corporates through our SAF program, it's like because we are selling scope 3, and when we sell scope 3 to our corporates, this is the way we can actually improve our decarbonation trajectory. Exactly.
Do you have a sense of how significant you expect those corporate contributions to be as you scale?
So yes, we do projections, and I think it's gonna grow for the years to come. But it's still really difficult to have clear vision on what will be the corporates demand. So yeah.
it's perhaps yet another level more uncertain than some of the voluntary targets by airlines. I guess how I would characterize it, yet another level of uncertainty. Things can change in the future, so difficult to forecast. Andy, did you want to come in on that? I see you went off mute.
I was just going to say that at the end of the day, you go back to, we're doing this because we want to abate carbon. We don't need a new fuel. That wasn't what we were trying to do here. The new product is the carbon abatement. And so how do we finance that? And if we don't allow the Scope 3 credits to be financing the value of that capital to build that new co-product production capability, we're going to have a really difficult time scaling SAF. And so I think that's imperative that we allow the separation of the Scope 3 credits. We can put the systems in place to track that and make sure it doesn't get double counted and manage all the accounting of that. That's very capable with digital ledger technology today. And so let's recognize that if we don't do that, we're handcuffing the capability to build the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's another one of those situations where sort of the theory and the technology is there. That's not the challenge. It's doing this globally, getting the traceability, the transparency. I see somebody also put, what's our perspective on book and claim, and I don't want to repeat what's already been said. I think the theory's fantastic, but the specifics, if we look back to the bridge in terms of the regulations, the patchwork that we currently have, the different systems popping up, until we get to something that's big enough to work on a global scale, it will continue to be uncertain. I don't know what you think, Grant. Would you agree with that on book and claim specifically? I mean, I wouldn't want to stick my neck out and say we'll have a global book and claim in 3 years, but I know lots of people would like that to be the case.
Sure, and I think all three of y'all have made great points on that. I think the one thing I would add is that I agree that it is critical. I think the development of book and claim would be critical to scaling SAF, and we've already seen a bit of a model of that in the U.S. when it comes to RNG. You can purchase and offtake RNG through a book and claim methodology. You can drop RNG into an interstate pipeline, and you can have an offtaker in California, and that's how RNG works for California's LCFS program. So we've seen it at scale. We've seen it succeed. So there's no reason to think that it can't be developed around SAF. But I mean, I agree with you. I wouldn't stick my neck out and say, it's online in 3 years and here's how it's exactly going to work. So
yeah, absolutely. Right. I want to make sure we also get to asking some of the questions. So just for a bit of context, we have for the last 2-3 months been developing a report, which you will, by being on this webinar, certainly get copies of as when we're done with it, and an element of that report has been sort of surveying a really large number of people around the world in different parts of the SAF value chain on some of their views, and what we thought would be quite sort of fun to do on this one is we just have 3 questions. If you have done the survey, they'll be familiar to you, but just to take the pulse. And then I'm interested in sort of when we see what you've all said, how that compares to what we've already seen, and also what we think about it on this webinar panel. So Ros, if you could please pop up the first one, the first poll. How optimistic are you about SAF achieving widespread adoption by 2030? Now, widespread adoption, it obviously doesn't mean 100% SAF, to be very clear. What we defined widespread adoption as is sort of in line with the scale up required to meet net zero 2050 target. So if we think about getting to the 10%, some airlines perhaps up over 10%, that qualifies as widespread, bearing in mind that we're currently still at the 1%, sub 1% level. So there's your choices, and I think Ros will take down the answers when people have, or we'll share the answers when people have responded. So I think you click an option. Right, let's see. Only 6% is very optimistic, 28 quite optimistic, 42 neutral, incremental but insufficient, and then we have 25% are on the pessimistic side. So if you close that, and we'll do a quick comparison to what we heard from the 600 or so people who responded. It's not entirely different. We had slightly fewer entirely pessimistic ones, 23% there. you can either reveal how you voted and tell us why, or reflect what you make of this answer. And Grant, I'll put you on the spot first. What are your thoughts on this question about the level of optimism in the community?
I mean, I think that tracks with what we're hearing from producers and developers. I think it's encouraging, at least, that more of us are in the optimistic camp than the pessimistic camp. I'm not surprised that there's a bit of a split. I think this gets back to there being a bit of uncertainty on the US front right now. And when you take a step back and you look at the numbers and goals, they are daunting. But when you're in the trenches, sort of like we are, you, me, Andy, Margot, you do see that people are passionate about this. You do see that projects are getting financing and getting off the ground, and you do see that offtake is being signed. It might not be at the pace that everyone wants, or perhaps that needs to be to meet something like the SAF Grand Challenge in the US, but I think there is positive momentum. I'm not surprised on the split. I fall in the optimistic camp, and I think more of us will gravitate there over the coming years.
I think next time we'll have to get one of the naysayers on this, because I think we're in danger of being in violent agreement. Is that a fair guess? What about Andy, Margot?
So I would say that my assessment would be the same, but what I've seen in the last 6 months is a shift in focus, where before we were talking about a lot of 2020, 30, 2040, 2035, that time horizon. What I see in the last 6 months is a very near-term focus in the conversations that have taken place. So it's been a shift from 2030 and beyond to I'm focused on 2026, 2027, 2028. Don't bother me with anything that's farther out than that right now. And so that concerns me because of the lead time it takes to build these plants. So I just want to flag that as something that I'm seeing that might be a little bit of a shift in what you saw in the poll.
And of course that presents a significant challenge for financing, right? The certainty of those long-term offtakes, the minimum 10 years that we hear as sort of an ideal for a bankable case, then that is a real challenge. Without going off on that tangent too far, Margot, what were your thoughts on the level of optimism?
So I'm optimistic by nature, so I'm quite happy to see that all the participants are also optimistic, because I truly believe that at some point we will get there, but we need to start and to keep being convinced today, and to keep all our strengths on track. And going back to what just Andy said is, under the EU, we can see a lot of new projects, newcomers starting or willing to produce, e-fuels, because under the EU, Refuel EU, we have, this sub-mandate for e-fuel by 2030. So it's already, 1% of e-fuel, and that's already a lot of volume. And if we want to see one drop of e-fuels by 2030, we need to see some e-fuel projects reaching FID by the end of 2025. And this is the tricky part, because they need billions each projects, which are quite small, because they will each of them will, produce like between 50 KT, 100 KT. So I'm always talking in tons, but 50 and 100 KT. But to produce that, they will need, the minimum. What I hear is really, 1 billion investment, and this is where financing is really key to have this project starting by 2030. So our point as an airline, we can see, because we're technology agnostic. So we buy for now what is available. We really rely on FI. We can see a lot of producers, so we buy FI, and we don't see shortage in the supply for now. And we can easily think that by 2030 we will fulfill our mandate, at least the EU mandate, and also some part of our voluntary demand. But there is a huge gap by 2030 and 2035, which is really uncertain. And this is where we will need all new projects, and also because there won't be maybe enough availability on biomass. So that's why we need to have new new projects, new e-fuels, new things, and we need to be confident and to start listen to him and invest in this new project right now.
Yeah, no, I mean that the ESAF conversation could fill another separate conversation. It's something we're pretty involved in, is particularly in the Nordics, for feedstock cost reasons. But yeah, no, that's the gap there is still a bit that's insurmountable, and yeah. Seemingly, right. I've got two more questions that I'm going to pop up before we run out of time. And the first one is about barriers. So this one is, which of the following do you see as the main barrier to increasing SAF adoption? So high costs, limited production capacity, inconsistent policies. We've touched on a number of these. Uncertainty about long-term demand, lack of infrastructure for SAF distribution and storage. We touched on that too. Limited stakeholder collaboration. That's sort of what the theme of this discussion is a little bit. And technical challenges with blending. So what are your thoughts? You only get one, and I suspect many of you will have more than one, but you have to pick your favorite or your least favorite. There we go. Right. High cost. I suspect that won't surprise. Of course, the costs, this is sort of a chicken and egg situation here about the costs and the capacity. But inconsistent government policies, they're in second place, which we certainly see a huge amount of. And we'll continue, I think, to make our jobs more difficult, and everyone involved in this who are working on this. Do you agree with this panel in brief? Would you agree with this ranking? Cost, policy, and limited production or supply constraints as being the top three? And then Rose, I guess in the meantime, we could just flash up what we've heard so far and see if they're the same. Yeah, except a flip around on 2 and 3. But yeah, the top 3 seem pretty consistent. What are your thoughts? I'll go to you first, Margot.
So, I mean, we share the same sky. So to make our sky greener, we need a global regulatory framework. So certain inconsistency, will make our life or our job more difficult, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Grant?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's surprising to see those in line with our initial survey results. I think one point I'd like to make on SAF, and I'd like to get Andy's input here too, is that yes, right now it is high cost, but a lot of it depends upon the pathway. It depends upon the specifics of your project. There are ways to optimize and to reduce costs. There are ways to find efficiency and economies of scale. So, if you look at a high level umbrella number, there might be some sticker shock, but I would like to make the point that is not the cost of SAF across all projects. And I, hopefully I tee up Andy with a bit more detail there.
Yes, and so let me pull it apart a little bit. As I've already mentioned, at Gevo, we can do cash production costs competitive with petroleum cash production costs of Jet A. And so it is about the capital we need to do the abatement, and that varies from pathway to pathway. ESAF today has a very high capital cost and a very high cost of carbon abatement. And in ATJ, we have a very low cost of carbon abatement that we can do. And so I think if I pulled your questionnaire a little bit one level deeper, it's, can we develop the market for carbon so that the airlines like Margot and Air France can get their corporates or their consumers to be willing to pay a little bit for that cost of carbon and make commitments, or can we separate those in a book and claim and get corporates to buy the carbon separately and independent of the fuel? However we do that, it's that carbon value that has to develop to pay for the capital we need so that we can get these plants built.
Thanks, Andy. And I think that segues nicely onto the last one. Obviously, the price we talk about a lot. It's important for investors and producers. It's certainly important for airlines, as Margot mentioned, a third of costs on fuel. We get asked quite a lot to forecast prices. Obviously, we do it more scientifically than this, looking at costs and contract structures. This is just a little pulse poll. How much by 2030 do you expect SAF to cost relative to conventional jet fuel? So yeah, I won't read out the percentages. Interested in your thoughts. We recognize, of course, that there won't be one price. We recognize that people will have contracts, spot prices will be different, and depending on also the type of SAF. Interested, right? Let's see what we've got. Okay, so actually the biggest one was 50% more than jet fuel, and the second one is 100%. Interesting. It's certainly that suggests a significant reduction in the relative price than what we're seeing now. I guess that would be seen as positive from an airline perspective, Margot, and perhaps a challenge for a producer to unless you're filling the green premium there that you mentioned, Andy. Let's see what the survey said, and then have a final reaction before we run out of time on sort of little forward look at the end. So the survey was similar to this, and I found this is pretty interesting. I think when we ran the weighted average, it was something about 115% across all of the survey responses by 2030. So just over double. I'm not going to ask you how much you pay for SAF, Margot, because I'm sure you won't want to say, but sort of interested in your reactions to this as a 2030 outlook relative to jet.
So we heard that SAF, 1 or 2 years ago, we heard that SAF used to cost 2 to 3 times the price of jet. Now we can see that the price has decreased a little bit because we can see another supply compare with the demand. So today it would be much more than 100% of the cost of jet. So that will double the price by 2030. There will be different SAF, different technologies, and I actually don't know where it will go. But for sure, we will need to have financing mechanism to help lowering the gap between the jet, because we've been acting with kerosene for years now, so acting as an airline, and we won't be able to handle and to manage too much additional cost for SAF. So yes, but it's a question mark for everyone, I would say.
Yeah. Grant, does your crystal ball say anything on price? You want to
we do forecast SAF pricing, and again, it's pathway dependent, and then you have further considerations below that. I would say for the bulk of SAF, that 50 to 100% range makes sense. Obviously, HEFA SAF is going to be your cheaper end right now, and then as we mentioned, eSAF right now, PTL is it could be up to 3 times the cost. So yeah, I mean, I would largely agree. I would just point out that I think Margot makes a great point. There's more competition entering the market. We're figuring out ways to scale. We're figuring out ways to optimize. Feedstocks are, in some instances, getting cheaper and more readily available when you look at power and potentially hydrogen down the road. So I'm optimistic about the future, but not surprised at the results there.
Right, Andy, did you have anything else to add before we wrap up?
Yeah, I'd quickly add that I think it depends on what the value proposition is. If you have a bundled value proposition with the fuel and the abated attributes, then that's going to be more than Jet A. It has to be. We also will see the costs of those come down over time as the experience curve happens. So that absolutely will take place. And then at Gevo, we have a next generation technology that will take a significant part of the capital and operating costs out of even the existing ATJ routes that we have today that we patented are now starting to scale up. So there are multiple ways where we'll see those costs come down, but I think it depends really on what value proposition are you talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And that point about it not being a single price, it's not yet anywhere near a globally liquid market, which is commoditized like Jet A1 is. We're coming up towards the end. So I guess there's a couple of things that I want to just make sure we get across. We've had a number of questions which we haven't been able to pick up. I'm happy for us to collate some of our answers. And when we send out some of the materials, happy to send those out if you're interested. We will, as I mentioned, the report will go into much greater detail than we've been able to touch on, but hopefully this discussion gives you a sense of some of these interconnected challenges, this ecosystem join up that's making this scale up, these different conversations, the different uncertainties that we are picking our way through as we scale. I certainly don't want to have the last word though. So instead of looking out to 2050, because I think 2050 still feels very far away, even though it'll come around quick enough. I'm interested in sort of where you see the SAF scale up by end of 2025. I'm not looking for a number particularly, unless you'd like to put one, but sort of what you see changing between now and year end, and then also as a milestone for 2030, just in a few words. And I will pick on Grant to go first.
Maybe this is an aspirational hope by the end of 2050 or 2025. Sorry. I'd like to see guidance finalized. I'd like to see 45Z clarity. I'd like to see a bit of calming of volatility at the federal level, and leadership at the state level continue to develop.
SAF Grand Challenge met?
Maybe not by 2025.
No, 2030. 2030.
I don't know. Probably not, but I think we make good progress. SAF Grand Challenge is very aspirational. I'm glad we have it out there. I'm glad it's in the market. I think it's a good goal to strive towards.
Got it. And Andy, do you share that view?
We'll get ATJ 60 to FID and move the project ahead. So that'll be a big step in that direction. And we'll have other projects advancing around the world. Perfect.
Final word to Margot.
And same for airline, we commit to actually reach 10% of SAF, which I actually hope we do by 2030, and we can actually also try to embark new others airlines to do same.
Great. I think that's a positive note to end on. Thank you so much for joining. We will follow up with the materials and with further details on our research in this space, and look forward to speaking to many of you soon.